Let's talk about Gene Sharp. Focusing on this book, quite well known actually in various circles, From Dictatorship to Democracy. It's a very small thing. It's supposed to be a practical guide for, quote, disintegrating a dictatorship and replacing it with a democracy. So that was Sharp's project, I guess, throughout much of his life. He died at age 90 in 2018 after having spent many decades exploring nonviolent resistance in various respects with a big emphasis on practical outcomes and a big emphasis on international applications. So this is one reason to do Sharp, is because of the kind of worldwide ripples of his work and his worldwide emphasis. Although he taught at University of Massachusetts for much of his career, studied with Arne Næss in Norway. Interesting career, and I mean he was. Very early on, he was secretary to A.J. Muste, who Sharp describes as the most eminent American pacifist. I guess I should have done an episode on A.J. Muste. We've seen his effects, though, in his influence in several figures, especially Bayard Rustin, who was also a secretary to A.J. Muste. All right. Gene Sharp, in some ways, and I think he's paid a cost for this, his particular application of nonviolence is more in keeping with sort of mainstream American democracy and even the idea of bringing democracy to the world, although certainly Sharp didn't think that should happen under the auspices of the United States government, but under the auspices of the people of each country. At any rate, he's been accused at times of working for the CIA. I think that's ridiculous. Or of being an agent of neoliberalism. I don't think that's sensible either. But you can see how this happens because he was real big on how the communist dictatorships could be overthrown and superseded nonviolently. Like he was so into and present in and influential on, to some extent. I mean, it's debatable how influential he is on all these movements, but lots of people all over the world are reading this book in lots of different languages. All right. Okay, so as communism disintegrated, this applies beautifully to that, and is in part derived from the insights of those movements, like Solidarity in Poland. And so you can see how someone might think like he's on America's side in the Cold War. But again, I think that's fucking bullshit, and it's left-right shit. Okay, left-right bullshit. Because what he's against is totalitarianism, dictatorship in every form, left or right. He's like Arendt in that regard, right? Like he's very explicit, like left, right, it all is murderous. It all sucks. The biggest difference between leftists and rightists is the yip-yap, etc. Okay. But it's also true he's no anarchist. And he does think that dictatorships should be replaced by democracies. And by democracy, he means like a constitutional, I think, sort of, very liberal, classical liberal, but maybe all to the point of forswearing violence. So he wrote this book initially, I think, let me try to recall this. requested to do so, requested to get a practical guide for how we can overthrow our dictatorship from some people in Burma. And he felt that he did not have a good handle on the Burmese situation, and Burmese language and so on. And so he said, I can't really address the specific situation of Burma right now. I just don't have the information. But I'll give you like general guidelines for getting rid of a dictatorship and replacing it with a democracy by non-violent means. I mean, another interesting thing about Sharp is that he doesn't usually present nonviolence as an absolute principled prohibition. He portrays it primarily as the most practical mode of resistance. Now, you might think that's ridiculous or something like that, but he has very good reasons. Okay. So the question is, a question is, if violence were practical for achieving democracy, would he endorse it? I'm not perfectly clear on the answer. I mean, we can be perfectly clear on the answer with most of these pacifists. It's absolutely not. Violence is absolutely prohibited. But for Sharp, it's more like, what can effectuate a transition from dictatorship to democracy? I mean, also, he's not primarily writing about places like the U.S., is he, if he's talking about replacing dictatorships? Because he doesn't mean the U.S. style of government or leadership when he talks about dictatorships. He means all over the world, left-wing, right-wing, military dictatorships, communist dictatorships, fascist dictatorships, etc. That's quite a different context than we've seen, which, like the anti-slavery movement, the civil rights movement, these domestic questions, resistance movements within the United States, anti-war movements, peace movements, okay? This is about worldwide movement to democracy. And at a certain point, like in the middle of the Arab Spring, it seemed that Sharp was incredibly influential on many of the people that were prosecuting that beautiful transition. But then the Arab Spring disintegrated, okay? Like it replaced governments in a number of places, but it got repressed and led to further dictatorships, actually, right? Or preservation of, like, say, Assad's dictatorship in Syria and so on. Although that's gone now, isn't it? It took a while and it took violence. All right. Well, okay, so, I mean, I don't think this, actually the end of this is a famous bit where he lists 198 techniques of nonviolent resistance. I mean, should I read them? Maybe I'll refer you to him or link to him. And he is more systematic and more careful in enumerating and developing nonviolent strategies than almost anyone. Not only in this book, but in much longer texts and stuff too. And this comes from others of his writings, Symbolic public acts gives you number 18 to 30. Display of flags and symbolic colors, wearing of symbols, prayer and worship, delivering symbolic objects, protest disrobings, destruction of own property, symbolic lights, displays of portraits, paint as protest, new signs and names, symbolic sounds, symbolic reclamations, rude gestures, all right, like blowing raspberries and stuff like this, all right? And I mean, and all the way up to general strikes and stuff like this, okay? And very concerted and risky nonviolent action. One thing he says is, you don't start with risky mass actions because you may well take casualties. So start, if you were trying to begin a resistance movement, with small symbolic actions that are relatively harmless. Like if you place flowers at a a place where something bad happened or something like this. Like he is into the beginning with the simplest of gestures, okay, and then seeing that all the way up to an effective nonviolent overthrow of a system, which we saw in the color revolutions, right, and in the Arab Spring, and this 198 forms of nonviolent resistance is an attempt to sort of take you from just the little gesture of no or the little symbolic expression all the way to the societal transformation. So yeah, I mean, some of the initial arguments for nonviolent opposition are very interesting, I think. I mean, they're somewhat familiar, but I must say I find them, I'm even surprised by how convincing I find them and how quickly. Arguments against violent resistance. Maybe we should talk to Peter Gelderloos, who has written about Sharp very hostily. I'm going to have to look that up, though. I read about him writing about Sharp. But anyway, so here is, page 6 of this edition of Dictatorship to Democracy. Whatever the merits of the violent option, violent revolution or resistance, one point is clear. By placing confidence in violent means, one has chosen the very type of struggle with which the oppressors nearly always have superiority. You can challenge the Egyptian army, but if you challenge them militarily, is that realistic? I mean, you're challenging them on their own ground. The dictators are equipped to apply violence overwhelmingly. That's how they became dictators. However long or briefly these democrats can continue, eventually the harsh military realities usually become inescapable. The dictators almost always have superiority in military hardware, ammunition, transportation, and the size of the military force. Despite bravery, Democrats are almost always no match. When conventional military rebellion is recognized as unrealistic, some dissidents then favor guerrilla warfare. However, guerrilla warfare rarely, this is interesting and it's based on empirical study. He's really into that. Guerrilla warfare, and he could back these assertions, I believe. Guerrilla warfare rarely, if ever, benefits the oppressed population or ushers in a democracy, which to him is always the goal. Guerrilla warfare has no obvious solution, given the very strong tendency toward immense casualties among one's own people. The technique is no guarantor against failure, despite supporting theory and strategic analyses like Che Guevara's book Guerrilla Warfare, and sometimes international backing. Even when successful, guerrilla struggles often have significant long-term negative structural consequences. Immediately, the attacked regime becomes more dictatorial as a result of its countermeasures. If the guerrillas should finally succeed, the resulting new regime, and again, he might be talking about Cuba and stuff like this. Okay, so this is why he's sort of greeted as reactionary in certain circles. If the guerrillas should finally succeed, the resulting new regime is often more dictatorial than its predecessor due to the centralizing impact of the expanded military forces and the weakening or destruction of society's independent groups and institutions during the struggle. And this is really key to Sharp's presentation of nonviolent resistance. Strengthen society's independent groups and institutions. That's what a dictatorship or a totalitarian system does. It tries to destroy all, this is totalitarianism, it tries to destroy all sort of independent organizations and institutions, whether it's the media, almost anything, okay? Religious institutions. During the struggle, bodies that are vital in establishing and maintaining a democratic society. And that is really a big, sharp insight. Encourage non-state organizations. Dictatorships can't withstand that in a way, can't tolerate that. And so by creating and expanding them, this could be a very effective mode of resistance. All right. Nor is it a good idea to go with a coup or try to accomplish a coup or try to recruit a few military people to overthrow the government. This has bad results too. The removal of particular persons and cliques from the governing positions most likely will merely make it possible for another group to take their place. Theoretically, this group might be milder in its behavior and be open in limited ways to democratic reforms. However, the opposite is as likely to be the case. So a sort of military internal overthrow where they take over the radio stations and then the presidential palace or whatever, that's not going to get you free either. And, you know, again, he doesn't in this book, but he does elsewhere, and we could, with more history even, enumerate many examples. Violent revolution often, characteristically, leads to systems that are more violent and less democratic than the system that they attacked, even if they did it in the name of peace and democracy. Right, the communist systems are the most beautiful examples of this. All right, or the French Revolution, for God's sakes, you know, whatever. Like, we're worse than our oppressors after a minute. And then he says things like this: be very leery, or basically do not accept foreign aid, foreign assistance. Now, this is one reason why this can't really be a CIA document, okay? Like, you know, that's what the CIA wants you to do in your little movement, is accept our aid so that we can, you know, in the Cold War context or whatever, and then we can control your country after you're done. All right. Now, this does, and this book is often compared to Machiavelli's Prince and stuff like this, but this stuff does sound a lot like Machiavelli in a way. Like, why shouldn't you occupy another country? You know, and it gives you like practical problems. Like if you're setting up a foreign government in a country away from your capital or whatever, you got many difficulties. Here's a list of 20 of them, says Machiavelli, and Sharp does something similar with, if you're in a resistance movement, democratic resistance movement, and the CIA or the foreigners come to you saying, we'll support you, it's going to be very tempting. You don't have enough resources, and they will offer you some. But foreign states may also be willing to sell out and oppress people instead of keeping pledges to assist their liberation at the cost of another objective. Some foreign states will act against a dictatorship only to gain their own economic, political, or military control over the country. Like, no shit. The foreign states may become actively involved for positive purposes only if and when the internal resistance movement has already begun shaking the dictatorship, having thereby focused international attention on the brutal nature of the regime. Dictatorships usually exist primarily because of the internal power distribution in the home country. The population and society are too weak to cause a dictatorship serious problems. Wealth and power are concentrated in too few hands. International pressures can be useful when they're supporting a powerful internal resistance movement. But if you become dependent on foreign sources, you'll lose your power, okay? And your movement is very likely to be co-opted by foreign governments who are likely to be no better in some ways than the one you're overthrowing, or they may be no better. The conclusion is a hard one. When one wants to bring down a dictatorship most effectively and with the least cost, these are very practical ideas, the least cost. Then one has 4 immediate tasks. One must strengthen the oppressed population themselves in their determination, self-confidence, and resistance skills. One must strengthen the independent social groups and institutions of the oppressed people. One must create a powerful internal resistance force, and one must develop a wise, grand strategy plan for liberation and implement it skillfully. And then he talks about like different levels of planning: grand strategy, tactics, and more fine-grained than that. Like, it's a pretty systematic presentation. And Sharp, this is something that, well, he attributes himself to Etienne de la Boétie, and we hit this before in one episode or another. I'm trying to remember who else availed themselves of these insights. But for Sharp, dictatorships, totalitarian or oppressive systems are only possible because the population cooperates, capitulates. In some ways, it's the whole population that's responsible. And if the population didn't cooperate, no dictatorship could persist. There might be massacres and shit on the way out. But, so it's people's voluntary cooperation that props up these things. He calls this the monkey master insight, and he relates a Chinese philosophy story about a guy who ran a bunch of monkeys as a criminal gang or something like this, and suddenly the monkeys realize, like, why are we doing what this person says? Is there some reason we obey this person? I mean, like, what if we didn't? Then we could have all the fruit we want and stuff like this. Okay. So that's kind of like it's a version of an insight you might get in a very profound way from Michel Foucault. Power comes from the bottom. But it's an old insight. Like I say, Etienne de la Boétie. Michel de Montaigne's friend, is that right? So that is the goal of nonviolent resistance, is to awaken the population to their own power and the unsatisfactoriness of their own position, oppression, inequality that they are facing. Right? But if you can show the population that they can resist, and resistance can have good effects, then they're very likely to resist. Right? And that's the goal of nonviolent action, starting with small symbolic actions and rising to mass actions, transformations, general strikes, and so on, is to show the population every day that they can resist, and that the dictatorship only persists because the resistance permits it to, in a way. Of course, the price of resistance can be astronomical for a particular person or for a group as well. And, he needs to take that seriously. He does on and off. Another thing he says, and I mean, again, these are really practical advice in a context that we haven't seen before in other episodes, because it's this international context, which is, the one thing he says is, be very leery or do not negotiate with the regime that you're trying to overthrow. What do you think they have to give you? And what do you think they want from you? What are you going to accomplish by negotiation? The offer by a dictatorship of peace through negotiations with the democratic opposition is, of course, disingenuous. The violence could be ended immediately by the dictators themselves, if only they would stop waging war on their own people. Now we're I guess, in a revolutionary situation. They could, at their own initiative, without any bargaining, restore respect for human dignity and rights. These things that, what are you doing, negotiating for these things? They could do this if they wanted to immediately. They don't want to, because they're not those kind of people that respect human dignity and rights. Free political prisoners, end torture, halt military operations, withdraw from the government, and apologize to the people. All right, so what are you going to get from them if you're negotiating? Although you might be forced into negotiation, by military by circumstances or whatever. But in these type of conflicts, he says, the only proper role for negotiations may occur at the end of a decisive struggle in which the power of the dictatorships has been effectively destroyed and they seek personal safe passage to an international airport. So that's the only really practical application of negotiations with a dictator, is that when it gets to the point of, yeah, okay, we're going to let you go to your villa in the south of France or whatever, like dictators sometimes do. And you can understand why they reach deals like this. It's just too much of a hassle. I mean, we're going to put this guy on trial. Maybe his supporters will come back or whatever, Like, I just want this fucker gone, okay? And then let's get on with creating this new nation or whatever. But I mean, these are very practical things, Here's an insight. Maybe I don't know what passages to read here. And this is typical because he really has explored what nonviolent resistance does or is. Nonviolent struggle is a much more complex and varied means of struggle than is violence. Instead, the struggle is fought by psychological, social, economic, and political weapons applied by the population and the institutions of the society. And he's exploring all those weapons, at least 198 psychological, social, economic, and political weapons. These have been known under various names of protests, strikes, non-cooperation, boycotts, disaffection, and people power. As noted earlier, all governments can rule only as long as they receive replenishment of the needed sources of their power from the cooperation, submission, and obedience of the population and the institutions of the society. Political defiance, unlike violence, is uniquely suited to severing those sources of power. Violence cannot transform the basic human relation to power, which is what keeps these oppressive systems in place. But nonviolence can show a population that their oppression is in part due to their own lack of resistance. And that can show people that there is hope for transformation. Now, I think, he helped show people all over the world. I mean, it's interesting that who ends up inspiring movements. I mean, I was shocked to find that the green anarchist Murray Bookchin has been incredibly influential through the Middle East, like in the Kurdish resistance zones in northern Syria and stuff. David Graeber has been extremely influential on nonviolent resistance. These intellectuals, Graeber is not a pacifist, though. Actually, so I shouldn't say that. But it's interesting what texts become practical guidelines. All right, but I do think I was incredibly inspired and felt incredibly hopeful during the Arab Spring. And it's been incredibly depressing to see what's happened in the Middle East afterwards, hasn't it? But that doesn't mean the moment wasn't inspiring. That doesn't mean that that they didn't show that these systems can be transformed. That doesn't mean that the people of these countries didn't take a kind of agency that they hadn't before. And the outcome is not completely determinate, okay? I think things can still happen, even in the Middle East, all right? But if anything good is going to happen, it's going to happen like this, I think. I mean, I'm sort of convinced on Sharp's grounds that violent revolution is not likely to lead to a more democratic or freer system, that coups are not, that, foreign projects to extend democracy are not, or American democracy, but internal nonviolent resistance is demonstrably the practical way that, it hasn't all turned out ultimately the way we wanted or whatever, but the ultimate practical way that oppressive systems have been transformed. Arab Spring being a beautiful example. I mean, not in its outcome. And Sharp having some role of Sharp's thinking. And the Albert Einstein Institution. Sharp was like a personal nonviolent think tank known as the Albert Einstein Institution. And that's because he wrote a letter to Albert Einstein early on in this thing and said, like, I hear you're a pacifist. Love you, Albert. And Albert wrote back saying, like, I support everything you're doing. Okay? Albert Einstein was totally committed to nonviolence. Right? So in the Albert Einstein Institution of Gene Sharp, I don't know what it's doing right now without Gene Sharp, if anything. But it had amazing effects, man. And good effects, I think, overall. All right, Gene Sharp. And then, okay, I'm thinking 2 more episodes. Judith Butler. And then some kind of response to Gelderloos and maybe others who have attacked pacifism in various ways on the grounds that other forms of resistance are more effective, or that, in fact, nonviolent resistance is just a mode of capitulation, or is helping neoliberal capitalism or something like that. Okay, so maybe 2 more episodes. But Butler's book, The Force of Nonviolence, is really, it's moving and changing my thinking in some ways. So I might be a little while getting to that, but I will.